From Matthew Henry's commentary on the book of Romans, chapter 1, verses 19 through 32. In this last part of the chapter, the apostle applies what he had said particularly to the Gentile world, in which we may observe 1. The means and helps they had to come to the knowledge of God. Though they had not such a knowledge of his law as Jacob and Israel had, Psalm 147:20, yet among them he left not himself without witness, Acts 14:17, for that which may be known, etc., verses 19 and 20. Observe. 1. What discoveries they had. That which may be known of God is manifest among them. That is, there were some even among them that had the knowledge of God, were convinced of the existence of one supreme noumen, or divine presence. The philosophy of Pythagoras, Plato, and the Stoics discovered a great deal of the knowledge of God, as appears by abundance of testimonies. That which may be known, which implies that there is a great deal which may not be known. The being of God may be apprehended, but cannot be comprehended. We cannot by searching find him out, Job 11:7-9. Finite understandings cannot perfectly know an infinite being, but, blessed be God, there is that which may be known, enough to lead us to our chief end, the glorifying and enjoying of him. And these things revealed belong to us and to our children, while secret things are not to be pried into. Deuteronomy 29:29. 2. Whence they had these discoveries, God hath shown it to them. Those common natural notions which they had of God were imprinted on their hearts by the God of nature himself, who is the Father of lights. This sense of a deity, and a regard to that deity, are so connate with the human nature, that some think we ought to distinguish men from brutes by these, rather than by reason. 3. By what way and means these discoveries and notices which they had were confirmed and improved, namely, by the work of creation, verse 20, for the invisible things of God, etc. 1. Observe what they knew, the invisible things of him, even his eternal power and Godhead. Though God be not the subject of sense, yet he hath discovered and made known himself by those things that are sensible. The power and Godhead of God are invisible things, and yet are clearly seen in their products. He works in secret, Job 23:8 and 9, Psalm 139:15, Ecclesiastes 11:5. But manifest what he has wrought, and therein makes known his power and Godhead, and others of his attributes which natural light apprehends in the idea of a God. They could not come by natural light to the knowledge of the three persons in the Godhead, though some fancy they have found footsteps of this in Plato's writings. But they did come to the knowledge of the Godhead, at least so much knowledge as was sufficient to have kept them from idolatry. This was that truth which they had held in unrighteousness. 2. How they knew it, by the things that are made, which could not make themselves, nor fall into such an exact order and harmony by any casual hits, and therefore must have been produced by some first cause or intelligent agent, which first cause could be no other than an eternal, powerful God. See Psalm 19:1, Isaiah 40:26, Acts 17:24. The workman is known by his work, the variety, multitude, order, beauty, harmony, different nature, and excellent contrivance of the things that are made, the direction of them to certain ends, and the concurrence of all the parts to the good and beauty of the whole, do abundantly prove a Creator, and his eternal power and Godhead. Thus did the light shine in the darkness, and this from the creation of the world. Understand it either, 1. as the topic from which the knowledge of them is drawn. To evince this truth, we have a recourse to the great work of creation, and some think this creature of the world, as it may be read, is to be understood of man, the most remarkable creature of the lower world, Mark 16:15, the frame and structure of human bodies, and especially the most excellent powers, faculties, and capacities of human souls, do abundantly prove that there is a Creator, and that He is God. Or, 2. As the date of discovery, it is as old as the creation of the world. In this sense, these notices concerning God are not any modern discoveries hit upon of late, but ancient truths, which were from the beginning. The way of the acknowledgement of God is a good old way. It was from the beginning. Truth got the start of error. Their gross idolatry, notwithstanding these discoveries that God made to them of Himself, described here, verses 21 through 23 and verse 25. We shall the less wonder at the inefficiency of these natural discoveries to prevent the idolatry of the Gentiles, if we remember how prone even the Jews, who had Scripture light to guide them, were to idolatry. So miserably are the degenerate sons of men plunged in the mire of sense. Observe 1. The inward cause of their idolatry, verses 21 and 22. They are therefore without excuse, in that they did know God, and from what they knew might easily infer that it was their duty to worship Him, and Him only. Though some have greater light and means of knowledge than others, yet all have enough to leave them inexcusable. But the mischief of it was that they glorified Him not as God. Their affections toward Him, and their awe and adoration of Him, did not keep pace with their knowledge. To glorify Him as God is to glorify Him only, for there can be but one infinite. But they did not so glorify Him, for they set up a multitude of other deities. To glorify Him as God is to worship Him with spiritual worship. But they made images of Him. Not to glorify God as God is in effect not to glorify Him at all. To respect Him as a creature is not to glorify Him, but to dishonor Him. Neither were they thankful, not thankful for the favors in general they received from God. Insensibleness of God's mercies is at the bottom of our sinful departures from Him. Not thankful in particular for the discoveries God was pleased to make of Himself to them. Those that do not improve the means of knowledge and grace are justly reckoned unthankful for them. But they became vain in their imaginations, in their reasonings, in their practical inferences. They had a great deal of knowledge of general truths, verse 19, but no prudence to apply them to particular cases, or in their notions of God, and the creation of the world, and the origination of mankind, and the chief good. In these things, when they quitted the plain truth, they soon disputed themselves into 1,000 vain and foolish fancies. The several opinions and hypotheses of the various sects of philosophers concerning these things were so many vain imaginations. When truth is forsaken, errors multiply in infinitum, infinitely, and their foolish heart was darkened. The foolishness and practical wickedness of the heart cloud and darken the intellectual powers and faculties. Nothing tends more to the blinding and perverting of the understanding than the corruption and depravedness of the will and affections. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. Verse 22. This looks back upon the philosophers, the pretenders to wisdom and professors of it. Those that had the most luxuriant fancy in framing to themselves the idea of a God fell into the most gross and absurd conceits. And it was the just punishment of their pride and self-conceitedness. It has been observed that the most refined nations that made the greatest show of wisdom were the arrantest fools in religion. The barbarians adored the sun and moon, which of all others was most specious idolatry, while the learned Egyptians worshipped an ox and an onion. The Grecians, who excelled them in wisdom, adored diseases and human passions. The Romans, the wisest of all, worshipped the Furies, and at this day the poor Americans worship the thunder, while the ingenious Chinese adore the devil. Thus the world by wisdom knew not God. 1 Corinthians 1:21. As a profession of wisdom is an aggravation of folly, so a proud conceit of wisdom is the cause of a great deal of folly. Hence we read of few philosophers who were converted to Christianity, and Paul's preaching was nowhere so laughed at and ridiculed as among the learned Athenians. Acts 17:18-32. Conceiting themselves to be wise. The plain truth of the being of God would not content them. They thought themselves above that, and so fell into the greatest errors. The outward acts of their idolatry, verses 23-25. Making images of God, verse 23. 1. Making images of God, verse 23, by which, as much as in them lay, they changed the glory of the incorruptible God. Compare Psalm 106:20, Jeremiah 2:11. They ascribed a deity to the most contemptible creatures, and by them represented God. It was the greatest honor God did to man that he made man in the image of God, but it is the greatest dishonor man has done to God that he has made God in the image of man. This was what God so strictly warned the Jews against, Deuteronomy 4:15, etc. This the apostle shows the folly of in his sermon at Athens, Acts 17:29, see Isaiah 40:18, etc., 44:10, etc. This is called, verse 25, changing the truth of God into a lie. As it did dishonor his glory, so it did misrepresent his being. Idols are called lies, for they belie God, as if he had a body, whereas he is a spirit. Jeremiah 23:14, Hosea 7:1. Teachers of lies, Habakkuk 2:18. 2. Giving divine honor to the creature, worshipped and served the creature, besides the Creator. They did own a supreme noumen in their profession, but they did in effect disown him by the worship they paid to the creature. For God will be all or none, or above the Creator, paying more devout respect to their inferior deities, stars, heroes, demons, thinking the supreme God inaccessible, or above their worship. The sin itself was their worshipping the creature at all, but this is mentioned as an aggravation of the sin, that they worshipped the creature more than the Creator. This was the general wickedness of the Gentile world, and became twisted in with their laws and government, in compliance with which even the wise men among them, who knew and owned a supreme God, and were convinced of the nonsense and absurdity of their polytheism and idolatry, yet did as the rest of their neighbors did, who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Verse 18. It is observable that upon the mention of the dishonor done to God by the idolatry of the Gentiles, the apostle, in the midst of his discourse, expresses himself in an awful adoration of God, who is blessed forever. Amen. When we see or hear any contempt cast upon God or his name, we should thence take occasion to think and speak highly and honorably of him. In this, as in other things, the worse others are, the better we should be, blessed forever, notwithstanding these dishonors done to his name. Though there are those that do not glorify him, yet he is glorified, and will be glorified to eternity. The judgments of God upon them for this idolatry. Not many temporal judgments, The idolatrous nations were the conquering ruling nations of the world, but spiritual judgments, giving them up to the most brutish and unnatural lusts. He gave them up. It is thrice repeated here, verses 24, 26, and 28. Spiritual judgments are of all judgments the sorest, and to be most dreaded. Observe. 1. By whom they were given up. God gave them up in a way of righteous judgment, as the just punishment of their idolatry, taking off the bridle of restraining grace, leaving them to themselves, letting them alone. For his grace is his own. He is debtor to no man. He may give or withhold his grace at pleasure. Whether this giving up be a positive act of God, or only a privative, we leave to the schools to dispute. But this we are sure of, that it is no new thing for God to give men up to their own heart's lusts, to send them strong delusions, to let Satan loose upon them, nay, to lay stumbling blocks before them. And yet God is not the author of sin, but herein infinitely just and holy. For, though the greatest wickedness follow upon this giving up, the fault of that is to be laid upon the sinner's wicked heart. If the patient be obstinate, and will not submit to the methods prescribed, but willfully takes and does that which is prejudicial to him, the physician is not to be blamed if he give him up, as in a desperate condition, and all the fatal symptoms that follow are not to be imputed to the physician, but to the disease itself and to the folly and willfulness of the patient. 2. To what they were given up. 1. To uncleanness and vile affections, verses 24, 26, and 27. Those that would not entertain the more pure and refined notices of natural light, which tend to preserve the honor of God, justly forfeited those more gross and palpable sentiments, which preserve the honor of human nature. Man being in honor, and refusing to understand the God that made him, thus becomes worse than the beasts that perish. Psalm 49:20. Thus one, by the divine permission, becomes the punishment of another, but it is, as it said here, through the lust of their own hearts. There all the fault is to be laid. Those who dishonored God were given up to dishonor themselves. A man cannot be delivered up to a greater slavery than to be given up to his own lusts. Such are given over, like the Egyptians, Isaiah 19:4, into the hand of a cruel lord. The particular instances of their uncleanness and vile affections are their unnatural lusts, for which many of the heathen, even of those among them who passed for wise men, as Solon and Zeno, were infamous against the plainest and most obvious dictates of natural light. The crying iniquity of Sodom and Gomorrah, for which God rained hell from heaven upon them, became not only commonly practiced, but avowed in the pagan nations. Perhaps the apostle especially refers to the abominations that were committed in the worship of their idol gods, in which the worst of uncleanness were prescribed for the honor of their gods. Dunghill service for dunghill gods. The unclean spirits delight in such ministrations. In the Church of Rome, where the pagan idolatries are revived, images worshipped, and saints only substituted in the room of demons, we hear of these same abominations going barefaced, licensed by the Pope, Fox's Acts and Monuments, Volume 1, page 808, and not only commonly perpetrated, but justified and pleaded for by some of their cardinals. The same spiritual plagues for the same spiritual wickednesses. See what wickedness there is in the nature of man. How abominable and filthy is man. Lord, what is man? Says David. What a vile creature is he when left to himself. How much are we beholden to the restraining grace of God for the preserving anything of the honor and decency of the human nature. For, were it not for this, Man, who was made but little lower than the angels, would make himself a great deal lower than the devils. This is said to be that recompense of their error which was meet. The judge of all the earth does right, and observes a meetness between the sin and the punishment of it. 2. To a reprobate mind in these abominations, verse 28. 1. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. The blindness of their understandings was caused by the willful aversion of their wills and affections. They did not retain God in their knowledge, because they did not like it. They would neither know nor do anything but just what pleased themselves. It is just the temper of carnal hearts. The pleasing of themselves is their highest end. There are many that have God in their knowledge. They cannot help it. The light shines so fully in their faces, but they do not retain him there. They say to the Almighty, "Depart," Job 21:14, and they therefore do not retain God in their knowledge, because it thwarts and contradicts their lusts. They do not like it. In their knowledge, there is a difference between gnosis and epignosis, the knowledge and the acknowledgement of God. The pagans knew God, but did not, would not acknowledge him. 2. Answerable to this willfulness of theirs, in gainsaying the truth, God gave them over to a willfulness in their grossest sins, here called a reprobate mind, a mind void of all sense and judgment to discern things that differ, so that they could not distinguish their right hand from their left in spiritual things. See whither a course of sin leads, and into what a gulf it plunges the sinner at last. Hither fleshly lusts have a direct tendency. Eyes full of adultery cannot cease from sin. 2 Peter 2:14. This reprobate mind was a blind, scared conscience, past feeling. Ephesians 4:19. When the judgment is once reconciled to sin, the man is in the suburbs of hell. At first, Pharaoh hardened his heart, but afterwards God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Thus willful hardness is justly punished with judicial hardness, to do those things which are not convenient. This phrase may seem to bespeak a diminutive evil, but here it is expressive of the grossest enormities, things that are not agreeable to men, but contradict the very light and law of nature. And here he subjoins a black list of those unbecoming things which the Gentiles were guilty of, being delivered up to a reprobate mind. No wickedness so heinous, so contrary to the light of nature, to the law of nations, and to all the interests of mankind, but a reprobate mind will comply with it. By the histories of those times, especially the accounts we have of the then prevailing dispositions and practices of the Romans, when the ancient virtue of that commonwealth was so denigrated, it appears that these sins here mentioned were then and there reigning national sins. No fewer than 23 several sorts of sins and sinners are here specified, verses 29 through 31. Here the devil's seat is. His name is Legion, for they are many. It was time to have the gospel preached among them, for the world had need of reformation. First, sins against the first table. Haters of God. Here is the devil in his own colors, sin appearing sin. Could it be imagined that rational creatures should hate the chief good, and depending creatures abhor the fountain of their being? And yet so it is. Every sin has in it a hatred of God, but some sinners are more open and avowed enemies to him than others. Zechariah 11:8. Proud men and boasters cope with God himself, and put those crowns upon their own heads, which must be cast before his throne. Secondly, sins against the second table. These are especially mentioned, because in these things they had a clearer light. In general, here is a charge of unrighteousness. This is put first, for every sin is unrighteousness. It is withholding that which is due, perverting that which is right. It is especially put for second-table sins, doing as we would not be done by. Against the fifth commandment, disobedient to parents, and without natural affection, parents unkind and cruel to their children. Thus, when duty fails on one side, it commonly fails on the other. Disobedient children are justly punished with unnatural parents, and, on the contrary, unnatural parents with disobedient children. Against the sixth commandment, wickedness, doing mischief for mischief's sake, maliciousness, envy, murder, debate, malignity, despiteful, implacable, unmerciful, all expressions of that hatred of our brother, which is heart murder. Against the seventh commandment, fornication, he mentions no more, having spoken before of other uncleannesses. Against the eighth commandment, unrighteousness, covetousness. Against the ninth commandment, deceit, whisperers, backbiters, covenant breakers, lying and slandering. Here are two generals not before mentioned, inventors of evil things and without understanding, wise to do evil, and yet having no knowledge to do good. The more deliberate and politic sinners are in inventive evil things, the greater is their sin. So quick of invention in sin, and yet without understanding, stark fools in the thoughts of God. Here is enough to humble us all, in the sense of our original corruption, for every heart by nature has in it the seed and spawn of all these sins. In the close he mentions the aggravations of the sins, verse 32. 1. They knew the judgment of God, that is, 1. They knew the law. The judgment of God is that which his justice requires, which, because he is just, he judgeth meet to be done. 2. They knew the penalty. So it is explained here. They knew that those who commit such things were worthy of death, eternal death. Their own consciences could not but suggest this to them, and yet they ventured upon it. It is a great aggravation of sin when it is committed against knowledge, James 4:17, especially against the knowledge of the judgment of God. It is daring presumption to run upon the sword's point. It argues the heart, much hardened, and very resolutely set upon sin. 2. They not only do the same, but have pleasure in those that do them. The violence of some present temptation may hurry a man into the commission of such sins himself, in which the vitiated appetite may take a pleasure. But to be pleased with other people's sins is to love sin for sin's sake. It is joining in a confederacy for the devil's kingdom and interest. They do not only commit sin, but they defend and justify it, and encourage others to do the like. Our own sins are much aggravated by our concurrence with, and complacency in, the sins of others. Now lay all this together, and then say whether the Gentile world, lying under so much guilt and corruption, could be justified before God by any works of their own.